Hey everybody, welcome to week 7 in our series on the works and words of Jesus. We're finishing up the first half of this series by looking at the last miracle where Jesus raises someone from the dead. And throughout these miracles, what we've been seeing is that Jesus has absolute authority over everything in life, from the weather to demons to even death itself. Now, this text is a longer text. Normally, I read through the passage before we get started. This text is a little bit longer, and so I'm not going to read the whole text, but I encourage you to do so. Perhaps pause the video and take time to read through this miracle in John 11. But what I want to do is I want to start off by kind of zooming out. Since this is a larger text, I want to give you a picture of what's really going on in the big picture. Really, there's if you break it down into different chunks, you can start to see some structure. First, I know the words may be too small to even see, but you get a sense for the structure here. In the first 3 verses, you get a sense for the setting. Then what you see in verses 4 all the way through verse 16 is Jesus speaking to his disciples, speaking with his disciples. And really, in a lot of these sections, it's Jesus speaking with people. So Jesus speaks with his disciples here. Then Jesus speaks in the next section with Mary and Martha. And that's all the way down through Verse 35, Jesus interacts and speaks with Mary and Martha. Then what you see in the next section is that the Jews, those who are consoling Mary and Martha, they are speaking with each other. Then here in verses 38 through 40, Jesus speaks with Martha. Then Jesus speaks with the Father. Then last, Jesus speaks to Lazarus. And so what you see in this miracle is Jesus speaking with a lot of different people. He speaks with his disciples. He speaks with Mary and Martha. Then the Jews speak with each other. Then Jesus speaks to Martha again to roll away the tomb. Then Jesus speaks to the Father. Then Jesus speaks to Lazarus. Jesus is the one in control here. And this, I hope, gives us a good picture for the big picture. Now, let's dive in and take a look at this a little bit more in depth. First, in this first section, the first 3 verses, what we see is the setting and the characters. Well, who do we have here? Well, first there's Lazarus, then there's his 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. And we hear about these 3, this family in other places. They're friends of Jesus, and they live in a small town called Bethany. It's called here a village. Later on, we're going to learn that, let's see, here in verse 18, we read that Bethany is near Jerusalem. How near? Well, just 2 miles away. And that's significant because that's very close to right where the Jews were wanting to kill Jesus. We see that. And we're going to see that in verse 8, where the disciples are objecting. The Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going there again. And so that's the setting. It's Bethany, and it's very close to Jerusalem. And those are the characters, but the most important character, of course, is the Lord. What's the problem? Well, Lazarus is ill. You see that here 3 times. Is ill. He was ill. Obviously, this was a very serious sickness. But Jesus is far away at the moment when the message comes. Well, what we see here in this next section is that Jesus speaks with his disciples. And it's interesting because Jesus says this illness does not lead to death. But then Lazarus does die. Of course, Jesus knows what's going to happen. In some of the other miracles, you get this sense where Jesus, he's God, and so he knows what's going to happen. And why is he going to let some things happen? It's for the glory of God. And there's a lot in here about the glory of God, and so that the Son would be glorified through what happens. Well, Jesus says this. He says, let's go. Let's go to Judea again. But what's surprising is that he doesn't go right away. You would expect that Jesus would hear this. You would expect Jesus hears that Lazarus is ill, and he says, oh, let's go right away. But he doesn't. What he does instead is this. He stayed 2 days longer. And then he says, let's go. Now, the disciples start to object. They're going to raise two objections. The first one here is in verse 8. That's objection number 1. And what the objection is pretty strong. Hey, back at Jerusalem, they were trying to kill you. Are you sure it's a good idea? Jesus responds here. And here's what his response is going to be. Essentially, he doesn't have anything to hide. Jesus is innocent. He's not running from the law. He walks in the light. And he says this, we need to go. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. So the first objection from the disciples, Jesus doesn't accept. And that's, hey, it's dangerous to go back there. Next objection comes here in verses 12 and 13. The next objection the disciples have is this. Well, look, if he's just sleeping, well, he'll recover. Jesus had, it says in verse 13, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. And Jesus had kind of hinted at this. But again, what do you call it when someone dies, but they're only temporarily dead? You might call it sleep. Jesus tells them plainly, Lazarus had died. But then what's so surprising is verse 15. It seems almost insensitive here what Jesus says. For your sake, I'm glad that I was not there. And we're going to hear what Mary and Martha say. If only you were here, if only you were here, they say. But Jesus says, I'm glad I'm not there. Why? So that you may believe. And there's so much in this passage that's showing Jesus' power over death so that you would believe. But they need to go. And it's interesting, Thomas here has this little comment. It's like faith, loyalty, and doubt all mixed into one comment. Let us also go that we may die with him. So it's like he's loyal to Jesus, but we're all going to die. Interesting comment. So those are the objections. Jesus speaks with his disciples, but he responds to them, no, we are going to go. Lazarus has died, and I'm going to do something there to get glory. Next, what we see is that Jesus interacts here in this next section with Mary and Martha. What's happened is that a lot of people are coming. Many have come to console Mary and Martha. And that's as it should happen. Someone passes away, and then the friends come to comfort them. Martha hears that Jesus is coming, and she leaves, but Mary remained. You see that? Martha went, but Mary remained. It's interesting to me how this is a little bit different than the scene where it's actually Mary who's with Jesus and Martha who's away. Here it's flipped. And in this section, these verses, we get some amazing theology about resurrection. Amazing theology about Jesus' power. And that's what this conversation really highlights. Martha, hear the grief of Martha. She asked this question, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I guess not so much of a question. It's this cry of anguish. If only you were here. But see also her faith. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. So it's this, why weren't you here? And I still believe, and she's trying to piece this all together. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Now, there is a resurrection. In the end, there will be the resurrection of the living and the dead. All the dead will be raised, I should say. Martha hints at this. On the last day, I know that on the last day, in the resurrection, he will rise. But Jesus has something to clarify. It's almost like he's going to do something different. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. In other words, Jesus has the power to bring life. And then what he says is this, whoever believes, note the emphasis on belief, whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Resurrection depends on faith. Faith in Jesus. Jesus continues, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And her response really is amazing. Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who's coming into the world. I love that comment from Martha. Her brothers died. She doesn't understand everything that's going on, and yet she has this faith. Well, it's this conversation that she has with Jesus, talks about Jesus' power of the resurrection. So then she leaves. She leaves and she calls her sister, and she goes to Mary and she communicates a message. The teacher is here and is calling for you. So apparently Jesus had been calling. He wanted to see Mary. Mary does go, and Jesus isn't quite at the house yet. The Jews, they see Mary leaving, and they suppose that she's going to the tomb. Mary was actually coming to see Jesus, and what does she do? She falls down. You see the grief, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. You can see why Mary and Martha would be asking this. They didn't plan to say the same thing, I don't think. I think it's just that's what's bubbling up out of them. Jesus heals everybody, it seems. But the one he loves, us, he won't take care of his own? Why? That doesn't make any sense. We don't hear a lot of conversation between Jesus and Mary, but we do see tears. There's a lot of weeping going on here. Jesus sees her weeping. And then the Jews, Jesus sees them also weeping. And then Jesus weeps. Weeping, weeping, weeping. There's more here, though. Notice the emphasis on Jesus' grief. It says that he's deeply moved in his spirit, and he's greatly troubled. He's not just putting on a show. He's not just, I guess everybody else is crying, I should probably cry too. He's moved. He's troubled. Death is not the way it's supposed to be. He's truly weeping. Imagine Jesus weeping. And I love this truth. It's like Jesus gives us permission to grieve. It's not a sin to grieve. It's not a sin to weep. It's not wrong when someone dies to weep. It's actually the right response. And I love this about Jesus, that he too weeps. It's not a lack of faith to weep. Jesus wept. So we see that's Jesus' interaction with Mary and Martha. Now we see Jesus has interacted with them, but the Jews start interacting with each other. These are the ones not who are wanting to kill him. These are the ones who were comforting, consoling Mary and Martha. Here's what they say. They're so confused. See how he loved him. So they're saying this doesn't make any sense. Jesus loved him, and yet he was able to open the eyes of the blind man. Couldn't that guy have kept him from dying? You know, today you hear a lot of people say things like this. Either God is all-loving but not all-powerful, or God is all-powerful, but he just doesn't love people very much. That's the only explanation for there to be suffering in the world and death in the world. People object to Christianity this way. And yet, Jesus has other plans. You can see how the Jews, they're confused by the same thing. It doesn't make sense. Jesus loves him and didn't heal him. What's the deal? Sometimes we ask that question too. Jesus says he loves us, and then sometimes he doesn't heal. How can we understand this? I think it goes back to this idea of glory, the glory of God. It comes up a lot in this passage Jesus is doing this miracle here so that they may believe. And earlier, as Jesus spoke to his disciples, let's see if we can go back that way. Several verses as he's talking to his disciples. He says that you may believe. And also in verse 4, remember, it's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. See, that's what the people aren't noticing. That's what the people aren't seeing. That sometimes Jesus allows suffering, and he loves people so that he would ultimately receive the glory. When Jesus gets to the tomb, he's going to speak to Martha. That's the next scene. But notice again, Jesus is deeply moved again. He didn't allow the suffering because he's callous. That's not why Jesus allows suffering or even death. No, he's deeply moved. Jesus says, take away the stone. Notice, is this scene ringing a bell for anybody else? It's a cave and there's a stone laying against it and there's going to be a resurrection. He says, take away the stone. Martha kind of is objecting, Lord, this isn't going to be right because there's an odor, she says. There's an odor. He's been dead for 4 days. And that's important because it shows us this isn't just a parlor trick. It's not that just, he fell unconscious and maybe he wasn't actually dead and then he recovered. No, he's been dead 4 days. And Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God? So belief, glory. Next scene, Jesus speaks to the Father. He prays. They take away the stone and he lifts up his eyes and he prays. And he's praying. The Father always hears Jesus. He's saying, I know that you always hear me, but he says this on account of the people who are standing. Why? So that they may believe. So much on belief. We come to the last bit here, where Jesus speaks to the man who is dead. He says this. It's very simple. He cries it out, though. It's loud. He doesn't say it softly. Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. As we read this text, what we find is that Jesus has absolute power over death itself. And if that's the case, that should cause us to trust him, to believe in him, to realize that sometimes God has bigger things going on when he allows suffering and even death. You know, I find encouragement in this thought. Those who are in Christ will be resurrected after they die. This isn't just a one-time event where Jesus resurrected one guy. Jesus will resurrect every single child of God. And it's just a matter of time. For some, like Lazarus, he did it here in history. For others, it's at the end. But for every child of Christ, their promise is resurrection. And because that's the case, we can trust Jesus. We can be loyal to him because he's good. He's reliable. He's trustworthy. As we look at all these miracles, I'm just blown away by the fact that Jesus has so much power. It's good for us to remember and reflect on the authority and power that Jesus has over everything from food to wine to foreigners to the weather to demons, even death itself. And that is an encouragement to me, and I hope it is to you as well. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.